There you go. Excellent. Hi, everybody. Pardon my very itchy nose. My allergies are completely bonkers today. Completely bonkers. So anyway, hi, I'm Natalie Case, author of the Through Shades and Shadows series. Um, and tonight I will be reading chapters 5. I'm getting ahead of myself, not 7, 5 of this book. The very first. Whoop! Why did you do that? The very first book in the series, called Through Shade and Shadow. And as always, in the description, you will find a link to the book on Amazon, my Venmo and PayPal, in case you're feeling generous and would like to help support an unemployed author trying to support herself in California. Um, Sorry. I was hoping the allergy pill I took a little while ago would have kicked in by now, but clearly it hasn't, so I apologize for that. We're also having a really hot day for so early in the year. So if I'm going to try to keep the second fan off, but I may have to. We'll see what happens. It's really, really warm, and I run really hot anyway. So that said, no wine tonight because I just took allergy meds and I don't want to keel over halfway through and fall asleep on you. So there you go for that. I will instead be drinking water. I'm something new on the screen on the left. I'm just checking it out. I'll be back with you in just a second. Yeah, okay. We'll set it to that. So we're about to pick up on chapter 5. If you'll recall, the odd chapters in this book are from one character's point of view and the even are from another character's point of view. We're about to jump back into Mason's point of view here with the chapter 5. And Mason is a shade living in the mountains of Northern California. And so we're going to just pick up and jump into that. If you recall correctly, the last chapter we did with Mason's point of view, he had just found someone who could help him understand and use his gifts properly after having been raised by a grandmother who was too afraid to actually teach him how to use his gifts. So here we go with chapter 5. Exhaustion pulled at his limbs, clouding his mind as he moved from the body of a child he couldn't save to a woman who was dying. The disease was spreading faster than even shades could heal, and it had even started to affect them as they attempted to halt its spread. The medicines they had were ineffective, and the number of dead continued to climb. "It isn't any ordinary disease," he heard someone say, and he looked up. A shade did this. He wanted to deny it, but it was the only explanation. Someone had planted this disease, like a spike that would leach out into the body and spread. Already people were afraid and pointing fingers. "Gavin, get some sleep." A hand came down on his shoulder, the older shade frowning at him. "You'll do us no good if you succumb." Fever burned in his skin, starting where that hand touched him and eating into him. He staggered to his feet, pulling away and pointing as he stumbled. The illness was already inside him, blackness soaking into his organs. He fell, grabbing for water, but his hands shook too much and he couldn't get enough into his mouth. Staggering out of the makeshift hospital, he grabbed at the first person he found, grabbing her and pulling her close so that he could breathe his last into her mouth, hoping the truth would find its way out. Mason broke the surface of the water, disoriented as he cast about him for something to hold on to. He was panting as he started back toward shore, his head a jumbled mess of memories that terrified him. It was something he'd never really considered, that a shade who could heal disease could also spread disease. It made sense, he supposed, and it certainly helped him understand his Nana's fears. She'd warned him about being used for evil, but never really explained what she meant. He was shaking as he climbed out of the water to grab at the towel he'd left on the shore of the pond. He dried himself and sat, slowly pulling the memory back to him. The shade was familiar somehow. He held the man's image in his mind and tried to call up more information than just his first name, Gavin. He spoke the name out loud, hoping it would spark something. The village was old, something from the old world, back in a time and place where shades were obviously accepted for their gifts. Mason closed his eyes and focused the way Paul had taught him, slipping back into the memory without losing himself in it as he had the first time. A part of him stayed separate to observe, looking at the people and the buildings as Gavin staggered out the door. The clothing suggested sometime in the early 1800s. Gavin's view of the village was limited, and Mason could only guess it was somewhere in Europe. After running through the memory twice, Mason dressed and headed back for the cottage. Paul was in the garden when he approached, looking up expectantly. Mason didn't say anything, just walked past him into the house. He stopped in the small kitchen, looking at his pack by the door. He had planned to leave. He was packed up and ready to head down the mountain, but a voice inside him said he wasn't ready. "You okay?" Mason looked up at Paul in the doorway, shrugging a little. He opened his mouth to respond, but shut it again and shook his head. He didn't know how to broach the subject. "The more I learn, the more I don't know," Mason said quietly. "More blocks?" Paul asked. "I'm not sure." Mason sat slowly. They'd taken several days working to overcome the blocks his grandmother had inserted into her own mind, blocks that kept many of the memories of his line suppressed, even once they had been passed on to him. "Gavin Frock," he said, the name slowly, the image of the man's face filling his mind. Paul nodded and moved into the room, pulling out a chair at the table. "I know of Gavin. My mother's grandmother died around the same time." Mason nodded, his hand idly tracing the lines of the wood table as the memory played through him again. It never occurred to me." "Oh." Paul sighed and sat back. "You never realized that if we can heal, we can also cause?" He shook his head. "It helps me understand why people are so afraid of us." "There are many reasons they fear us, Mason. Shades like Darchel, for one, and yes, there have been those of us through the centuries that have used the gifts we have to spread disease. There are those that believe the great wave of the Black Death began with a shade who was jealous of a man who had won the affections of a girl he loved. That was not the history he had learned. But then, history was mostly written by humans, and until recently, history had relegated shades to myths and legends, alongside unicorns and werewolves. Your grandmother did you no favors refusing to educate you, Paul said. Mason agreed now that he'd had a glimpse of how much he didn't actually know. How do you fight it? Paul frowned a little. Fight what? A sickness a shade creates. Paul bit his lip, crossing his arms. It sometimes isn't easy. These are the old ways, lost to most of us. He narrowed his eyes at Mason. We can manipulate a disease in little ways that aren't always easy to spot. It can make it difficult to get rid of. Even if we can heal them, the victim can end up with symptoms that last the rest of their lives. Mason could feel his grandmother inside him warning him away, telling him to be a good boy. He held his breath and looked up at Paul. Can you show me? Paul met his eyes, his face stern. I thought you wanted to get your book dealt with. Mason nodded. I do, but if I leave today or a week from today or a month, the book will still be there. What you're asking isn't easy, Paul said. It requires control that you don't yet have, and education and things that go beyond what we can do physically. It isn't something I can teach you in a week or in a month. There was an urgency inside him, pushing him, despite the warnings of his grandmother's voice. I'll stay. If you teach me, I'll stay. The room was quiet for a long moment before Paul stood up. Okay, make some dinner. I'm going to go finish in the garden. I need to go into town for some supplies after. You can ride along if you like. The sun had been up for nearly 2 hours by the time they emerged from the trees in an old Chevy truck with dark-tinted windows. The town that lay below them was bigger than he remembered, spreading out to fill the valley. It was picturesque as they descended the mountain and headed toward the town's center. Mason unrolled the sleeves of the flannel shirt he'd donned for this adventure, buttoning the cuffs to ensure most of his skin was covered. Paul handed him a list and a stack of bills. Get the groceries, I'll handle the hardware store. He dropped Mason outside a Safeway and headed off down the street. The store had been open for hours, but was still quiet as he pulled a cart from the corral and headed inside. A stock boy looked up, stifling a yawn to smile and say good morning as Mason cleared the automatic door. He stopped in the main aisle to look over his list, then up at the aisles to get an idea of the layout. Most of the list was canned goods, things that they would use to round up meals that came from the garden, fishing, and hunting. It felt strange being in the world outside of their little mountain. He'd seen so much of it from the television that it was familiar, and yet it was completely foreign at the same time. Mason pushed his cart toward the aisle, his eyes skipping around him, half expecting someone to be watching him. It was ridiculous. He hurried through the list, filling the cart with canned goods and cleaning supplies, flour and sugar and spices. He was on his way to the checkout when his eye caught on the headline of a tabloid. "Killer Shades at Large in America." Mason frowned as he reached for the tabloid. There was a picture of Darchel, clearly taken from the day of his arrest, blood covering his face. Under the picture was an article. He skimmed through it, frowning harder. It was filled with flat-out lies, including a list of traits to help identify potential shades hiding in your community. Things like pale face due to a lack of feeding on human blood, and demonic symbols protecting their home or their person, the lack of children, and other nonsense. He shoved the paper back into the rack and continued to the one checkout lane that was open. The magazines that lined the lane were more variants on the theme, including one that promised pictures from inside Darchel's home with the headline, "Inside the Lair of a Killer Shade," and another touting a movie in the making based on some hidden diary of Darchel's. On the cover of Time was that senator from Utah with a caption that indicated that Norman Douglas was behind a rash of panic-driven laws aimed at shades specifically. Mason pushed the fear that surfaced from within him away and unloaded his cart onto the belt, nodding hello to the young man behind the register. "Did you find everything okay, sir?" Mason glanced up and nodded. "Yeah." He watched the man's hands as they scanned his items. A teenage girl appeared at the end of the counter to bag his things. It all seemed remarkably normal. He handed off the cash when the man gave him his total and thanked them both. Paul hadn't returned yet, so Mason found a place in the shade to wait for him, leaning against the wall of the building. He kept vigilant, his eyes scanning around him. Something had him on edge. It was probably nothing more than the spotlight on shades, but he wasn't sure. His stomach lurched, the odd tickle of another shade filling him. He turned toward the feeling, expecting to see Paul in his truck. Instead, he saw a strange figure coming from the corner of the store. He was burned and bleeding profusely, leaving a trail of blood on the concrete and along the wall as he stumbled toward Mason, holding out a hand in desperation. Mason took a hesitant step toward him, grabbing at him as he started to fall and easing him slowly to the concrete. His skin was burned both from exposure to the sun and something more, his skin charred black. He was bleeding from multiple wounds, more blood than Mason had ever seen. His breath came in wheezing gasps as his hands fisted in Mason's shirt. "Help me." Mason pulled back involuntarily from the non-verbalized plea, his hands moving to the gaping wound in the man's side to try to staunch the flow of blood, but already he knew it was too late. "I'm sorry," Mason said, pulling the man's hands off him. "I don't know how it's to—" But the man was gone, his eyes darkening. Mason blinked as someone screamed, looking up and around him. He stumbled back into his cart. There was blood on his shirt and hands. People were gathering, and he heard sirens in the distance. What happened? It took a second for Mason to realize that the man beside him was talking to him. He blinked and looked at him, trying to reconcile it. He just came from over there." Mason pointed, though the trail of blood made it obvious. Someone was kneeling beside the victim. Like someone slowed time, Mason watched as police arrived, then an ambulance. People were moved, and he found himself getting dragged back out of the way as the scene filled with uniforms. "Mason." He tore his gaze from the scene and up to Paul, who was suddenly beside him. He distantly recognized that he was standing in the sun and shuffled a little to his right to move into the shade. "What happened?" Mason shook his head. I should have his line. It hadn't even occurred to him to take the man's last breath. His line would die with him. Paul grabbed his arm and dragged him further away from the scene. "Are you saying—" Mason nodded. It was too much. I couldn't, even if he'd known where to begin with injuries that catastrophic. He doubted there would have been time to save the man. "Okay, We need to go, Paul said, his hand firm on Mason's elbow. Excuse me. Shit. Paul breathed a curse and turned them to face the officer approaching them. I understand you were the one who found the body? Mason sort of nodded, then shook his head. He was alive. He found me. The memory of it played in his head, the smell of burnt flesh and blood, and he held up his hands, feeling them flush with the heat that had seeped from the wounds. I need to take your statement. Can't you see how upset he is? Paul said beside him, his hand moving from Mason's arm to his back. I'm sorry, but this is important. The officer made eye contact with Mason. Did the victim say anything to you? Help me. Bile rose in his throat, and Mason tried to swallow it, but as the words repeated, he lost the fight, doubling over to vomit. Paul's hand was warm on his back, gently pushing energy into him to calm the physical symptoms of his shock. Mason wiped his mouth and turned back to the officer. I'm sorry, no. He didn't say anything at all. He fell and I caught him, and then he died, and that's all. Sir, do you have a reason to believe this victim was a shade? Mason looked up sharply. What? The officer licked his lips and glanced over his shoulder. This is the second victim with the same type of injuries. The first was a shade, or so the note said. She was beaten, stabbed, burned, and left in a park. There was a note tied to her body that indicated she was a shade, and this would be the fate of all shades. Mason's stomach rumbled, and he turned to Paul. How is he supposed to know if the man was a shade? Paul asked. He just died. It's not like Mason knew the man. The officer's eyes swept over Mason, fixing on the bloody handprints on his shirt. Did he touch you, sir? What? Mason asked, pulling back. Did he touch you? Mason shook his head. No, he grabbed my shirt. I think it would be best to have you checked over. Mason pulled away as the officer reached for him. No, I'm fine. I just want to go. We may have more questions. Mason stepped away. I told you already, I don't know anything. He could see Paul's truck and headed for it, hoping the officer would take him at his word. A few minutes later, he heard Paul loading the grocery bags in the back of the truck. The door opened and Paul slipped behind the wheel, starting the truck and pulling out of the parking lot before he said anything. You okay? Mason didn't answer right away. He was trying to decide why he was so shaken up over it. It wasn't his first time witnessing death. Only this shade couldn't have been much older than Mason himself. And someone had done this to him, for no reason other than he was a shade. He asked me to help him, Mason said finally, his eyes on his bloody hands. In my mind. From what I saw, you couldn't have helped him. Mason knew that on some level, but it didn't ease the guilt twisting in his stomach. Maybe Nana was right, he said it quietly, not even fully out loud. Paul's hand touched his shoulder. The whole world isn't like that. Not what I'm seeing, Mason responded. They're publishing lies about us and telling people how to kill us. Hell, they're making a movie about Darchel. He rubbed his sticky palms together. They were cold now, the heat of life gone from the blood. He was one of us. I could have at least taken his last breath, so his line could go on. Don't beat yourself up about it. Lots of us die with no one to take our last breath. He won't be the last. He wasn't much older than me, Mason said, finally glancing up. Paul didn't respond. Just turn them onto the road that would take them back to their mountain safety, away from a world that seemed to increasingly hate them for no other reason than their existence. And that ends Chapter 5. On Sunday, we'll revisit Alaric's point of view, and we'll pick up on Chapter 6. Thank you for joining me, whether you did so live or you're going to watch it later, however that you happen to find us. That's awesome. And, stay safe out there. Stay warm if you're where it's cold and snowing, and stay cool if you're over here where it's all hot and muggy. And I will be talking to you again later in the week. Check out the link I'll be posting shortly. I am also going to be hosting a Zoom meeting conversation thing on Friday evening. I will post the link so that if you want to join us, you can. It's really literally just people from all kinds of areas of my life coming in together to talk and be with people as much as we can be with people right now. So anyway, y'all have a wonderful rest of your evening. I'm going to go find some ice water and get my fans turned back on, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.